Our Lady of Fatima is perhaps the most prophetic apparition that has ever occurred in the Church's history since the days of the Apostles. It is not a doctrine or official teaching of the Church, and indeed Catholics are free to disbelieve in it if they choose. But many Catholics, including myself, believe that the Virgin Mary really did appear to the 3 children at Fatima in 1917, and that her message, as the children communicated to the world, ought to be heeded. In this video, I want to explore a number of thoughts and theories I have about this event and its consecrations. I am not a prophet, nor have I received an apparition to explain these things. But I can only just use my own fallible reasoning to approach this, and as a result, many or even all the conclusions I make here may be flawed. On the other hand, I think that it is right to try to make these interpretations even though they are fallible. Consider this passage from the Gospel. Luke 12 verses 54 to 56, he also said to the crowds, "When you see a cloud rising in the west, you immediately say, 'It is going to rain,' and so it happens. And when you see the south wind blowing, you say, 'There will be scorching heat,' and it happens. You hypocrites! You know how to interpret the appearance of earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time?" Something important to point out about this story is that Christ tells us that we are supposed to interpret the present time. In other words, we are supposed to be trying to use our reason to figure out the signs of our times. If we can use our reason and observation to interpret the weather and the earth, then we should also use our reason and observation to interpret the spiritual signs of our times as well. We could be wrong about how we interpret the spiritual signs, but just as we apply our reason to interpret the natural signs and yet can make mistakes, I think that Christ is expecting us to try to interpret the spiritual signs, even though we are not prophets or visionaries. And it is in that line of thinking that I then approach this topic. To begin then, I want to first look at what Christ said about the signs that would precede the end of the world. In particular, consider this part. Luke 21 verses 9 to 11, "When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for such things must happen first, but it will not immediately be the end." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be powerful earthquakes, famines, and plagues from place to place, and awesome sights and mighty signs will come from the sky." Christ said that there would be wars and insurrections before the end occurs, but these themselves will not be the end. Now, there are people who have interpreted the 2 world wars, along with all the revolutions and overthrow of governments that happened in the first half of the 20th century, to be a fulfillment of this prophecy. Among people who made interpretations along those lines was Benedict XV, when he wrote his 1914 encyclical Ad Beatissimi Apostolorum, in which he called for peace just after the First World War had begun. I feel like the text of this encyclical resonates very greatly with the Fatima message, and even today, looking at the broken state of our world, it is still very relevant. Here is a small selection of the encyclical, where the Pope also interpreted the beginning of the First World War as the fulfillment of Christ's prophecy. But as soon as we were able from the height of apostolic dignity to survey at a glance the course of human affairs, our eyes were met by the sad conditions of human society, and we could not but be filled with bitter sorrow. For what could prevent the soul of the common Father of all being most deeply distressed by the spectacle presented by Europe, nay, by the whole world, perhaps the saddest and most mournful spectacle of which there is any record? Certainly those days would seem to have come upon us of which Christ our Lord foretold. "You shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. On every side the dread phantom of war holds sway. There is scarce room for another thought in the minds of men. The combatants are the greatest and wealthiest nations of the earth. What wonder, then, if, while provided with the most awful weapons modern military science has devised, they strive to destroy one another with refinements of horror? There is no limit to the measure of ruin and of slaughter. Day by day the earth is drenched with newly shed blood, and is covered with the bodies of the wounded and of the slain. Who would imagine, as we see them thus filled with hatred of one another, that they are all of one common stock, all of the same nature, all members of the same human society? Who would recognize brothers, whose Father is in heaven, Yet, while with numberless troops the furious battle is engaged, the sad cohorts of war, sorrow, and distress swoop down upon every city and every home. Day by day, the mighty number of widows and orphans increases, and with the interruption of communications, trade is at a standstill. Agriculture is abandoned. The arts are reduced to inactivity. The wealthy are in difficulties. The poor are reduced to abject misery. All are in distress. If we believe that Christ's prophecy was being fulfilled with the violence and warfare that began in the first part of the 20th century, as the Pope interpreted in 1914, then consider again what Christ said in the same part of his prophecy about what events would precede the end of the world. There will be powerful earthquakes, famines, and plagues from place to place, and awesome sights and mighty signs will come from the sky. Was the miracle of the sun at Fatima a fulfillment of this prophecy? If the first part of this prophecy was fulfilled with the world wars, then could the last part be fulfilled with the Virgin's apparition and miracle at Fatima? Consider also this prophecy in the book of Revelation, which has been interpreted by many people in reference to Fatima. Revelation 12 verses 1 to 5, a great sign appeared in the sky, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was with child and wailed aloud in pain as she labored to give birth. Then another sign appeared in the sky. It was a huge red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on its heads were 7 diadems. Its tail swept away a third of the stars in the sky and hurled them down to the earth. Then the dragon stood before the woman about to give birth, to devour her child when she gave birth. She gave birth to a son, a male child, destined to rule all the nations with an iron rod. Her child was caught up to God and his throne. I think it is reasonable to conclude that Fatima was being predicted by these prophecies in the Bible. The great red dragon fits well with communism and the spread of atheistic materialism throughout the world. Even the minor details are interesting. The Soviet Union had exactly 7 leaders from Lenin to Gorbachev, similar to the 7 heads and 7 diadems of the dragon. While the woman clothed with the sun fits well with Our Lady of Fatima and the miracle of the sun. Now, returning to Benedict XV's encyclical again, there's another part that I would like to quote. Pope Benedict explained what he believed was the reason for why this world war had broken out. But it is not the present sanguinary strife alone that distresses the nations and fills us with anxiety and care. There is another evil raging in the very inmost heart of human society, a source of dread to all who really think, inasmuch as it has already brought, and will bring, many misfortunes upon nations, and may rightly be considered to be the root cause of the present awful war. For ever since the precepts and practices of Christian wisdom ceased to be observed in the ruling of states, it followed that, as they contained the peace and stability of institutions, the very foundations of states necessarily began to be shaken. Such, moreover, has been the change in the ideas and the morals of men, that unless God comes soon to our help, the end of civilization would seem to be at hand. Thus we see the absence from the relation of men of mutual love with their fellow men. The authority of rulers is held in contempt. Injustice reigns in relations between the classes of society. The striving for transient and perishable things is so keen that men have lost sight of the other and more worthy goods they have to obtain. It is under these 4 headings that may be grouped we consider the causes of the serious unrest pervading the whole of human society. All then must combine to get rid of them by again bringing Christian principles into honor, if we have any real desire for the peace and harmony of human society. I think that this is essentially what Our Lady of Fatima said in a different way. She told the children that the world was going away from God, away from prayer, and away from the church, and that war was the consequence coming down on humanity. The Virgin warned about the errors of Russia spreading through the world, while the Pope grouped the causes behind the present strife into 4 categories. The first was the lack of love between human beings. The second was not recognizing the lawful authorities. Communism was very much tied with this second category, since it considered all authority, whether of monarchs over kingdoms or bosses over companies, to be human-made and not deriving from God. The third was the injustice between different classes in society. This was what led many people to embrace Marxism. The fourth was the seeking after material things. Communism's idea of human progress was a purely materialistic vision of progress, without any allowance that human beings had needs that went beyond the material world. The Virgin of Fatima, I think, was actually echoing what the Holy Father had already spoken, but in a different way. The Pope was perhaps speaking in more general terms, but she identified a specific country that was tied together with this. Lenin had not yet overthrown the Russian government when the Virgin Mary appeared at Fatima to warn about the errors of Russia. The Virgin was making the world know that God was already aware of what was about to happen. I think that this serves to support the faith of people who realize that actually what is happening is still very much within God's providence. Even when those who are changing history believe that history is controlled by human beings alone. The Pope and the Virgin both essentially said in different ways that the war was being caused by people abandoning the divine wisdom of God and instead trying to build a world controlled by human will only. The war came about because human beings wanted to be the master of their own world rather than having God as their master. Going away from God meant the world wars, but returning to Him meant peace. Next, I want to now quote what Sister Lucia wrote to the Bishop of Leiria Fatima in August 1941 when she explained what the Virgin had told the three of them in 1917. You have seen hell where the souls of poor sinners go. To save them, God wishes to establish in the world devotion to my Immaculate Heart. If what I say to you is done, many souls will be saved and there will be peace. The war is going to end, but if people do not cease offending God, a worse one will break out during the pontificate of Pius XI. When you see a night illumined by an unknown light, know that this is the great sign given you by God that He is about to punish the world for its crimes by means of war, famine, and persecutions of the Church and of the Holy Father. To prevent this, I shall come to ask for the consecration of Russia to my Immaculate Heart and the communion of reparation on the first Saturdays. If my requests are heeded, Russia will be converted, and there will be peace. If not, she will spread her errors throughout the world, causing wars and persecutions of the Church. The good will be martyred. The Holy Father will have much to suffer. Various nations will be annihilated. In the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. The Holy Father will consecrate Russia to me, and she shall be converted, and a period of peace will be granted to the world. I believe that Sister Lucia was a medium chosen by the Virgin Mary to serve as her special representative of Fatima's message. She fits into what I talked about in my theory about Psalm 45, as she perhaps had the special vocation of serving as the Virgin's medium to the world. If you haven't seen my video on that theory, I've put the link into the description below. This is important to understand because I think that whatever Sister Lucia said that the message of Fatima meant, we have to understand it as she explained it. I also think that her own life was showing an example for the world about how it is that people should live out the message of Fatima, and she served as the Virgin's medium in this way as well. When Sister Lucia said that there would be a night illuminated by an unknown light, I and others think that this is perhaps referring to the atomic bomb. The first atomic bomb detonation occurred just before sunrise on July 16th, 1945 in the Nevada desert. A note I can make about the date here is that July 16th is also the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. Sister Lucia was a Carmelite nun, and she supposedly saw the Virgin at Fatima wearing a Carmelite habit in the last apparition on October 13th, 1917. The coming of atomic weapons has changed the world. It means that any future world war might result in the complete annihilation of most of the human race. This is then perhaps a very heavy punishment that we are being threatened with. The Holy Father consecrated the world to the Immaculate Heart on October 31st, 1942. He then did it again on December 8th, 1942. However, Sister Lucia claimed that this did not fulfill the Virgin's wishes, because the consecration was supposed to be done in union with all of the other bishops of the world, and not just the Pope only. And if she said that this consecration was not valid, then I think we should assume that her explanation is the Virgin's explanation, if she is indeed serving as the Virgin's medium in this. But I think that this consecration in 1942 still brought benefit to the world. Because, of course, if you notice the date, December 8th is the solemnity of the Immaculate Conception. This is the beginning of Mary's life. World War II ended on August 15th, 1945, when Japan surrendered. August 15th is the solemnity of the Assumption, which is the end of Mary's life. I don't think it is a coincidence that those two dates match each other so well, and I interpret that perhaps Pius XII's December 8th consecration succeeded in bringing about an end to World War II, even if it didn't fulfill the Virgin's wishes for how the consecration should have been done. Pius XII, Paul VI, and John Paul II also did other consecrations without the assistance of the world's bishops. But then on March 25, 1984, John Paul II did a consecration in union with bishops throughout the world. In the years that followed, communism fell apart, piece by piece, within the Eastern Bloc, and then on December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned and handed the power of the Soviet presidency to Boris Yeltsin, president of Russia, thus effectively ending the Soviet Union. And many people have noticed how the dates fit with each other too. March 25th is the solemnity of the Annunciation, when Mary's pregnancy began. December 25th is the birth of Christ, when Mary's pregnancy finished. As the book of Revelation foretold, the male child was born and the red dragon could not devour it. Sister Lucia said that the 1984 consecration was done according to the Virgin's wishes. And again, following my thinking, if she said that this was done correctly, then it was done correctly. But if we return back to the prophecy, consider what Sister Lucia wrote in 1941. The Holy Father will consecrate Russia to me, and she shall be converted, and a period of peace will be granted to the world. Now John Paul II consecrated the world to the Immaculate Heart, not Russia specifically, although obviously Russia is part of the world. Russia has also not been converted. There has been some revival of the Russian Orthodox Church since the fall of communism. But is that really how we should interpret the meaning of conversion? Church attendance in Russia is still lower than what it is in many European countries. But I am wondering if maybe since the consecration was done differently, if the conversion is also different. For example, although Russia didn't convert after 1984, there is another country that did have a very important reunification with Rome. In 2007, Pope Benedict wrote that most of the bishops in China who had been ordained without Rome's approval had been reconciled with Rome. In 2018, Pope Francis recognized all bishops in China as being reconciled with Rome. Perhaps more than half of bishops in China had been separated from Rome since the 1950s when the communist government forced the Chinese Catholic Church to disassociate from Rome. But in the decades following 1984, this separation effectively came to an end. Maybe if John Paul II had only specified Russia as the country to be consecrated, the Russian Orthodox Church would have been reconciled to Rome, and then Russia would become a Catholic country. But since John Paul II specified the world to be consecrated, the resulting effect was that China's church was reconciled to Rome instead. This is not a small thing. Someday that church in China that has been reconciled to Rome might become the largest church in the world. And I think it was not inevitable that this reconciliation would have happened. Maybe if John Paul II had only specified Russia, most bishops in China today would still be separated from Rome. Another theory I have about this relates to the fact that Sister Lucia said that a period of peace would be granted to the world. How long is this period of peace supposed to be? Here is a portion of what John Paul II said when he actually did the consecration in 1984. The power of this consecration lasts for all time and embraces all individuals, peoples, and nations. It overcomes every evil that the spirit of darkness is able to awaken, and has in fact awakened in our times, in the heart of man and in his history. Here is what Pope Francis said in 2023. Today, the Third World War is taking place in a globalized world where conflicts involve only certain areas of the planet direct, but in fact involve them all. Pope Francis said that the conflicts happening during his pontificate were a Third World War. But John Paul II said that the effects of the consecration last forever. This seems like a contradiction, because if the consecration was supposed to prevent another world war from coming, then Francis can't be right about there being a world war now. But if we are in the midst of a third world war now, as Francis said, then it doesn't make sense to say that the consecration gave us a period of peace that will continue forever. Neither pope was making doctrinal statements when they said these things, so we don't really need to worry about finding a way to reconcile them with each other. However, I think a logical way of reconciling this is if we say that the effects of the consecration in 1984 indeed last forever, but the Virgin's actual promise of a period of peace was only for a certain duration after the consecration. If we take that understanding, then we return to the question again about how long this period of peace was supposed to be. If Francis is right, and we're in the midst of a third world war now, then it seems that this period of peace has already expired. Remembering again the prophecy in Revelation about the woman and the dragon, I think there may be a clue in this. The male child was born, and he ruled the world. God's kingdom prevailed, and not the dragon, who was trying to convince humanity to become its own master rather than God. How long was the life of Christ? The Gospel says that he was around 30 when he began preaching the Gospel, and he preached it for about 3 years. So traditionally, he died when he was 33. But Christ only had peace for the first 30 years of his life. Once he began preaching the gospel, the persecution against him began. And indeed, after he left the world, persecution and violence against his followers has effectively never had a time period when it was absent. With the exception of Herod's persecution at the beginning, the first 30 years of the life of the male child was the only period in the entire history of the kingdom of God when the kingdom was not being attacked. So, I'm going to make a hypothesis then that the period of peace granted from the consecration was only supposed to last for 30 years. The Virgin conceived and bore a male child who would rule the world, and similarly, the Pope consecrated the world on the Annunciation, and the Soviet Union ended on Christmas. I think the mysteries are intimately connected with each other, which is why it makes sense to say that if God's kingdom only had around 30 years of peace after the Incarnation, then there should only be around 30 years of peace after the consecration. To support this hypothesis, I point out the actual dates and events that have transpired. 30 years after March 25th, 1984 would be March 25th, 2014. Russia annexed Crimea in February and March 2014, and the Donbass War began in eastern Ukraine in April 2014. If we say that the 30 years is counted after the Soviet Union fell, it also works well, because 30 years after December 25th, 1991 was December 25th, 2021, and it was only 2 months later that Russia invaded Ukraine. It is as though all of those demons that have been sleeping since the end of the Cold War all awoke and started haunting the world again. The world had a brief period where the major nuclear powers were seemingly not at risk of entering into a conflict with each other, but that period was shattered by what happened first in 2014 and then in 2022. Maybe we can understand it that the devil was working to tempt the world into carrying out its own annihilation, and his plans were briefly interrupted in 1984. But since 2014, when the 30 years of peace expired, he has been permitted to get back to work again. Now, Pope Francis did another consecration on March 25th, 2022, just after Russia invaded. Like the 1984 consecration, this was also done with bishops throughout the world, like Sister Lucia had said was necessary. Was this consecration effective? Obviously, if it was supposed to end the war in Ukraine and restore an enduring peace between the nuclear powers, then that still hasn't happened. The risk of a military confrontation between NATO and Russia is still very much a possibility at the moment. I'm not aware if Sister Lucia ever said that the consecration could be repeated and the same promise would still hold. Although the 2022 consecration followed the same format as the 1984 consecration, I am not certain if we should assume that we would be given another period of peace following this consecration. Maybe that period of peace was just a one-time event, like the Incarnation itself, and it can't be repeated again. But on the other hand, even the other consecrations which weren't done according to the Virgin's wishes, according to Sister Lucia, still perhaps brought benefit to the world. It seems too coincidental that Pius XII consecrated the world to the Immaculate Heart on the day when Mary's life began, and World War II then ended on the day when Mary's life ended. Hence, if the incorrect consecration still brought some peace to the world, then even if the correctly done consecration can only be done once, it may also perhaps stand to reason that if it is repeated, then it may also bring benefit. Maybe the consecration can be done more than once, and each time it is done, it will renew the period of peace for another 30 years. There is a way to potentially test that hypothesis. The 1984 consecration took 7 years of time in order for the events to go step by step and end with the demise of the Soviet Union. From 1984 to 1991, the risk of nuclear confrontation was still there. If the 1991 coup against Gorbachev had succeeded, the Soviet hardliners could have then tried to reverse Gorbachev's policies and force the Eastern Bloc back under Soviet control, which could have even led to a hot conflict in Europe. Maybe the 2022 consecration is similar. After Pope Francis and the world's bishops did the consecration in March 2022, what we are seeing now are events occurring step by step, which will then end with some sort of peace 7 years later on Christmas 2029. Since Pope Francis specifically mentioned Ukraine and Russia in this consecration, maybe we should eventually expect some sort of reconciliation of the Eastern churches in those countries with Rome in the next few decades. Maybe the date when the peace comes will even be on January 7th, 2030, rather than on December 25th, 2029, since Orthodox Christmas is on January 7th. So in about 4 years from now, if some kind of lasting peace gets established on either December 25th, 2029 or January 7th, 2030, then that is perhaps a sign that we can repeat this consecration again and renew the period of peace. But if nothing happens, then I am not sure whether we have a way of knowing if the repetition of this consecration will bring about the same promise of peace as the first one, unless other evidence presents itself. I don't know what will happen, as I can only look at this with my reason. I don't have prophetic powers to know the future. But suppose that we do indeed receive such a sign 4 years from now, when something important happens on one of those dates that shows that the second consecration had the same effect as the first one. If that is true, then perhaps the Church should then eventually do a third and a fourth consecration. It should perhaps keep renewing consecrations indefinitely, in order to preserve peace in the world and prevent the devil from luring the human race to reject God's kingship, embrace their own kingship, and end up creating their own annihilation. If my hypothesis about the 30 years is correct, then the Church should be renewing this consecration at least every 30 years at most. In other words, the 1984 consecration should have been renewed in March 2014, rather than in 2022. Perhaps if it was renewed then, the Donbass War and the eventual Ukraine War would have never happened. But because the world went through 8 years without renewing the consecration, the result was perhaps that we now see in Ukraine what might have happened at the end of the Soviet Union had the hardliners succeeded in the coup and used violence to force the Soviet Empire back together again. If my hypotheses are correct, then by at least March 25th, 2052, the Pope at that time and all of the bishops of the world with him should renew the consecration again. And they should keep doing it every 30 years forever. And if they ever stop and wait too long after stopping, perhaps the devil will then have his victory, and then the world really shall be destroyed in nuclear fire. How could this peace come about in the next 4 years? I'm not a prophet, and I don't know. I wonder if Donald Trump has some role in this. He seems to be dismantling American alliances and influence around the world, perhaps like how Gorbachev's policies ended up putting an end to the Soviet Empire. And maybe how, like Gorbachev's reign ended with the end of the Soviet system, Trump's presidency will lead to the end of Western democracy. But how that eventually ends to a peace, I am not sure, unless the peace is concluded with the dominance of a converted Russia and the dictators who rule over us do so benevolently in obedience to the teachings of the gospel. Or maybe something else will happen. The war will end in a Ukrainian victory, Russia's current regime will fall, and the country will become an actual democracy. Maybe China will be forced to follow it on a similar trajectory. A new world order is formed that puts the world at peace for another several decades. I really don't know how this could play out in the next several years, but I have a hope that despite what the world looks like right now, all things are still in God's hands, and He may be secretly working a miracle out of what at the moment seems to be a disaster. As I said at the beginning of this video, I don't have the answers. I can only speculate, interpret, and reason, but much or even all of what I have hypothesized here may turn out to be wrong. Unfortunately, Sister Lucia is no longer with us to answer some of these questions, but if she is in heaven, she can still help us. If I am right in my thinking that she is specially chosen as the Virgin's medium regarding this particular message, then she may also be the person we should turn to in order to seek wisdom about this. In that spirit, I make the following prayer, which you can join with me. Sister Lucia, servant of God, if you are a saint in heaven and can help us with understanding the questions I have presented here, then please help the Church to know what it should do in the future about any further consecrations to the Immaculate Heart. Help us also to follow the message of Fatima in our lives so that we may be peacemakers in this world. Amen.